Look at the person sitting to your left. Now look at the person to your right. Statistically, one of them is running a standard human operating system, predictable, reactive, easily managed. But there's a fraction of the population, roughly 1 to 2%, operating on an entirely different cognitive frequency. We call them empaths, specifically the female empath. For years, behavioral science looked at these individuals through a lens of fragile compliance. They are the ones who absorb the energy in the room. They feel your anxiety before you open your mouth. They accommodate, they heal, they yield. And because of that, they become the primary target for the darkest personality types on the planet. The narcissists, the Machiavellian manipulators, the social predators. These predators look at an empath and see a perpetual resource. They think they found an open safe with no lock, but they are making a fatal miscalculation in human hacking. They assume that because someone can feel everything, they have no floor. They assume that compliance is weakness. What they don't see is the behavioral tripwire. Every human being has a breaking point. But when a highly sensitive, data-absorbing female empath hits hers, the psychological mechanics change instantly. She doesn't cry. She doesn't scream. She doesn't engage in the messy, predictable retaliation that standard profiles exhibit. Instead, she does something that completely violates the predator's predictive model. She shifts from a state of absorption to a state of absolute calculated reflection. In the next few minutes, we are going to deconstruct the exact behavioral mechanics of what happens when the most giving profile in human psychology decides she is done. We are going to map out the cold, silent pivot that leaves seasoned manipulators utterly destabilized, questioning their own reality and frozen in panic. If you have ever been taken advantage of, if you are currently dealing with someone who thinks they own your emotional responses, or if you simply want to understand the most terrifying psychological transformation a human being can undergo, you cannot afford to look away from this stage. Because what she does next doesn't just defend her boundaries, it completely dismantles the person who tried to break them. Every predator relies on a script. If you study interrogation, behavior profiling, or human hacking, you know that human manipulation is just a series of inputs designed to get a predictable output. The manipulator throws guilt, the target yields. The manipulator threatens withdrawal, the target chases. It's a loop. And for a long time, the female empath stays in that loop. She stays because her brain is literally wired to seek harmony, to find the hidden pain in the person hurting her, and to try to fix it. The manipulator mistakes this for a lack of sight. They think, she doesn't know what I'm doing. But here is the first psychological truth you need to understand tonight. She knows. She has absorbed every micro-expression, every shift in vocal tone, every lie, and every omission. She has a massive, highly detailed database of the manipulator's entire psychological blueprint. She hasn't weaponized it because her baseline behavior is set to grace, until the tripwire is hit. When a female empath is pushed past her absolute limit, when the hurt crosses the threshold from painful to structural, something shifts in her neurology. The emotional overflow shuts down. The warmth evaporates. And what happens next shocks everyone in her orbit, especially the person who broke her. She stops reacting. To the untrained eye, this looks like depression or surrender. To a behavioral profiler, this is the activation of the ghost profile. When the manipulator delivers the standard trigger, the insult, the gaslighting, the threat of leaving, expecting the usual emotional payout, they hit a solid stone wall. The empath looks at them with flat, neutral, unblinking observation. Do you know what happens to a master manipulator when they lose control of the target's emotions? They panic. Their heart rate spikes. Their behavior becomes erratic. They throw heavier inputs at the wall, trying to get a spark. But the hurt empath has stepped out of the arena. She is no longer absorbing the energy. She is simply observing it like a scientist watching a microbe under a microscope. Then comes the second phase, the mirror. Because she possesses the complete psychological map of her abuser, she knows exactly what they fear. She doesn't use this to scream at them. Instead, she begins to reflect their own behavior back to them with terrifying, robotic precision. If they are cold, she is absolute zero. If they are dismissive, she acts as if they have ceased to exist in the physical plane. She uses no emotional energy to do this. She simply allows their own darkness to bounce off her shield and blind them. And finally, the move that no one sees coming, the execution. Standard profiles leave trails. They threaten to leave. They pack boxes slowly. They block and unblock numbers. They write long paragraphs explaining their pain. They leave the door cracked for negotiation. The hurt empath does none of that. When she decides it is over, she performs a surgical extraction. She vanishes from the manipulator's life with a level of operational security that would impress an intelligence agency. Numbers are changed, assets are split, people are cut off. There is no final argument, there is no closure speech, there is no grand confrontation. There is only a sudden, permanent, echoing void where she used to be. The manipulator is left standing in an empty room, holding a script that no longer works, realizing too late that they didn't break a victim, they awoke an apex protector of boundaries. If you are the one pushing an empath to that edge, change your vector immediately. Because once that switch flips, there is no regression. And if you are the empath sitting in this room, wondering how much more you can absorb, know this. Your ability to feel is your strength, but your ability to shut the door is your power. Turn the mirror, step out of the loop, and let the void do the talking. To truly understand the internal mechanics of a highly sensitive individual, we must first dismantle the cultural myth that empathy is synonymous with weakness. In the field of behavioral profiling, we look at baseline behaviors, the standard, everyday operating system of a subject. For the female empath, that baseline is built upon an incredibly high-resolution situational awareness. While the average person moves through the world filtering out 90% of the emotional data around them, the empath's brain is constantly scanning, absorbing, and cataloging microexpressions, shifts in vocal syntax, pupil dilation, and autonomic nervous system changes in the people they encounter. They possess an involuntary, hyper-advanced radar for human emotion. However, because their primary objective is social harmony and connection, they project an outward demeanor of extreme vulnerability, compliance, and softness. They smile to ease tension. They yield in arguments to preserve the peace. They validate others at the expense of themselves. To the untrained eye, and specifically to the predatory personality types, this behavior looks like an open invitation. The narcissist, the manipulator, the social predator, they look at this baseline and misread it entirely. They see a target with no operational security. They see a psychological asset they can exploit indefinitely, assuming that because the doors to her emotional house are wide open, there are no walls inside. This is the blueprint of the invisible prey. The predator believes they are the apex operator in the dynamic, entirely unaware that the person they are manipulating actually holds a much higher resolution map of the environment than they do. The empath's apparent vulnerability is not a lack of defense mechanisms. It is a conscious choice to operate from a place of grace. They see the manipulator's masks, they register the subtle lies, and they track the incongruences between the predator's words and their actual behavior. But instead of weaponizing this data, the empath uses it to make excuses for the predator, assuming that if they just provide enough safety, the predator's underlying pain will heal. This creates a highly dangerous illusion for the antagonist. The manipulator becomes comfortable, arrogant, and sloppy, thinking they have successfully hacked a human being, when in reality, they have simply been granted access to a system that is voluntarily absorbing their toxicity. What the predator fails to realize is that this high-resolution data collection never stops. Every single slight, every gaslighting tactic, every microaggression is being recorded in the empath's cognitive database. The predator thinks they are getting away with their behavioral loops because there is no immediate pushback. They mistake patience for blindness and tolerance for submission. They do not understand that the empath is building a comprehensive psychological profile of them in real time. The vulnerability that the predator exploits is actually the very mechanism that allows the empath to gather the intelligence necessary to eventually destroy the predator's entire playbook. It is a silent accumulation of behavioral metrics. The empath remains invisible as a threat because her baseline remains gentle, compliant, and accommodating, lulling the manipulator into a false sense of absolute control. The predator genuinely believes they are running a successful operation against a defenseless target, completely oblivious to the fact that they are standing on a psychological tripwire, dealing with a subject who knows them better than they know themselves, and whose compliance is the only thing keeping the trap from springing shut. When the behavioral tripwire is finally triggered and the empath's capacity for absorption is entirely exhausted, the entire structural dynamic of the relationship undergoes an immediate, violent inversion. This is the moment the mirror metaphor materializes in its purest psychological form. Throughout the history of the interaction, the empath's primary tool was absorption, acting as a sponge for the toxicity, the chaotic emotional projections, and the fragmented reality of the antagonist. But when that sponge becomes completely saturated and calcifies into stone, the mechanism flips from absorption to absolute, flawless reflection. For the manipulator, this creates an immediate, catastrophic psychological crisis, because they are suddenly forced to confront their own unedited behavioral profile, turned back on them with mathematical precision. You must understand that a predator relies entirely on the target reacting to their inputs in a specific way to maintain their own sense of identity and control. When they throw rage, they expect fear. When they throw guilt, they expect submission. But the broken empath no longer generates those expected outputs. Instead, she becomes a perfectly flat, highly polished silver mirror. When the manipulator hurls an insult or attempts a gaslighting tactic, it no longer penetrates her emotional barrier. It strikes the surface of her new baseline and bounces directly back to its source. If the manipulator adopts a posture of cold indifference to punish her, they discover that she has instantly matched that indifference, but with an icy intensity that they cannot replicate. If they attempt to rewrite history, she simply reflects the raw, unvarnished facts of their behavior back into the conversation, completely stripped of emotional color or defensive justification. She does not argue, she does not scream, and she does not plead for understanding. She merely holds up the mirror. This shift is deeply destabilizing to the antagonist because it strips away their ability to hide behind their carefully constructed masks. For years, the manipulator has used the empath's emotional responsiveness to validate their own distorted worldview. Now, looking at the empath, all they see is the grotesque reality of their own Machiavellian tactics. It is a form of psychological jujitsu, where the empath uses the manipulator's own momentum, weight, and force to throw them completely off balance. The shock factor relies entirely on this precision. The empath knows every trigger, every insecurity, and every deep-seated fear that the predator possesses, because she spent months or years cataloging them during the absorption phase. When she decides to activate the mirror, she doesn't need to invent new weapons or engage in creative malice. She simply allows the predator's own dark psychology to dictate the parameters of the engagement. The predator is suddenly caught in an echo chamber of their own making, forced to breathe in the very poison they intended to inject into someone else. They try to navigate the interaction using their old playbook, but every single page they turn results in them hitting their own reflection. This leaves the seasoned manipulator utterly paralyzed, frantically looking for the person they used to control, only to realize that the gentle, accommodating target has vanished, replaced by a cold, objective evaluator who is weaponizing the predator's own psychological blueprint against them with devastating, algorithmic accuracy. The true tactical shift in this psychological inversion manifests during the phase of the silent de-escalation. In the realm of behavioral modification and threat management, we learn that all human manipulation is a dopamine-driven feedback loop. A predator or a high-conflict personality type does not abuse or manipulate in a vacuum. They do it to extract a specific behavioral currency. That currency is emotional output. Whether it is tears, frantic explanations, anger, or desperate pleas for validation, the manipulator feeds on the chaotic energy they stir up in their target. This reaction proves to the manipulator that they hold the remote control to the target's nervous system. However, when the hurt empath transitions into this third phase, she executes a move that completely starves the manipulator's behavioral loop: the total, uncompromising elimination of all emotional output. This is not a tactical pause or a passive-aggressive Simon treatment, which is itself a highly emotional and manipulative reaction. This is the absolute flatlining of emotional engagement. When the manipulator delivers what used to be a highly effective psychological trigger, expecting the standard emotional explosion or defensive retreat, they are met with a terrifying hollow vacuum. The empath's vocal tone drops to a neutral, uninflected cadence. Her body language transitions into a state of relaxed, open, but entirely detached stillness. Her eye contact becomes steady, unblinking, and entirely devoid of either hatred or affection. To the manipulator, this is an existential threat. The human brain is hardwired to fear a vacuum, and in interpersonal dynamics, the sudden absence of a reaction is far more terrifying than an aggressive counterattack. An aggressive response tells the manipulator that they are still winning, that they still matter, and that they still have power over the target's internal state. But this absolute silence communicates something entirely different. It signals that the manipulator has lost all leverage, that their inputs are no longer registering on the empath's emotional radar, and that their power has expired. The shock factor that leaves the antagonist completely destabilized relies on the sheer discipline of this emotional starvation. The manipulator will invariably escalate their behavior, throwing heavier, louder, and more toxic inputs at the empath in a desperate attempt to force a spark out of the system. They might scream, make outrageous accusations, or threaten abandonment. In the past, these tactics would have sent the empath into a tailspin of anxiety and accommodation. Now she simply watches the performance with the cold, detached curiosity of a behavioral scientist observing a subject behind a one-way mirror. She does not offer a defense, she does not counteraccuse, and she does not validate the attack by getting upset. By refusing to feed the loop, she forces the manipulator to sit with the full, unmitigated weight of their own escalating hysteria. The manipulator's heart rate spikes, their adrenaline surges, and because they are getting zero feedback from the environment, their predictive processing models collapse. They are left fighting a shadow, draining their own energy against a stone wall that refuses to push back, entirely frozen in panic as they realize that the emotional well they have been draining for years has instantly and permanently gone completely dry. Following the phase of total emotional flatlining, the dynamic moves into its most devastating and irreversible stage, the surgical extraction. In standard human behavioral profiles, even when a relationship is toxic, The process of separation is incredibly messy, loud, and protracted. Average individuals leave a trail of breadcrumbs. They issue warnings. They make threats about leaving. They engage in long, drawn-out arguments designed to get the other person to change. And they leave the door cracked wide open for negotiation or reconciliation. This predictable pattern gives a master manipulator exactly what they need: time and space to counter-strategize, deploy guilt trips, hoover the victim back in, and reset the abusive cycle. But the hurt empath completely bypasses this standard human script, which is why her next move shocks everyone who witnesses it. When she decides that a boundary has been permanently breached, she does not seek revenge, she does not seek an apology, and she does not seek to punish the manipulator. Instead, she seeks absolute, immediate, and permanent removal. The shock factor of the surgical extraction relies entirely on the fact that it is completely untelegraphed. There are no pre-indicators, no escalating threats, and no atmospheric shifts that warn the predator that the end is near. To the manipulator, everything appears normal right up until the exact second the trapdoor opens. The empath behaves with neutral compliance, masking the finality of her internal decision until the operational logistics are perfectly aligned. And then, in a single swift movement, she vanishes from the manipulator's life with the precision of a military operation. Phone numbers are changed instantly. Social media profiles disappear or are locked down beyond access. Physical assets are divided cleanly, often with the empath leaving money or possessions on the table just to buy her absolute freedom faster. Mutual acquaintances who act as flying monkeys for the manipulator are cut off without a second thought. There is no final confrontation, no dramatic speech where she explains how much they hurt her, and no opportunity for the manipulator to offer a counter-argument or a tearful promise to change. The empath understands that giving the predator a closing argument is simply giving them another chance to manipulate the narrative. By denying them this closure, she leaves them standing in a massive psychological void. The manipulator wakes up to find that the person who was the center of their emotional gravity has evaporated into thin air, leaving no footprint, no trail, and no avenue for contact. This absolute cutting of ties leaves no room for negotiation because there is no channel left open through which to negotiate. The predator is left frantically trying to send inputs into a system that has been completely dismantled and removed from the grid. They attempt to text, only to find the number doesn't exist. They try to visit, only to find the locks have been changed and legal boundaries have been established. This sudden, absolute erasure of their presence is the ultimate shock to the manipulator's ego. They are forced to realize that the person they thought they owned didn't just leave the room, they completely rewrote the reality of the environment so that the manipulator no longer exists in it, rendering the predator's entire arsenal of control mechanisms completely useless against a ghost. The final phase of this profound psychological evolution culminates in what behavioral profilers recognize as the apex shift. When the extraction is complete and the smoke clears, the hurt empath does not revert to the fragile, porous state that made her vulnerable in the first place. Instead, the trauma and the subsequent attachment trigger a radical structural reorganization of her entire personality matrix. She undergoes a metamorphosis from a defenseless target into an accidental master of operational security and threat management. For years, her primary cognitive vulnerability was her lack of psychological boundaries. She allowed the emotional states of others to bleed directly into her own nervous system, leaving the gates to her fortress wide open. But through the grueling process of surviving a predator, she learns how to take the massive torrent of emotional data she constantly absorbs and run it through a highly sophisticated cognitive filter. The very sensitivity that once allowed the manipulator to hack her operating system is now weaponized as an early warning radar system. She uses the detailed database of manipulative behaviors, micro-expressions, and deceptive syntax that she cataloged during her time in the trenches to construct an impenetrable biometric psychological firewall. She no longer grants unearned trust. When she interacts with new people, her hyper-awareness instantly flags the subtle signs of ego, control, or manipulation long before the average person would notice them. But unlike before, she no longer rationalizes or makes excuses for these red flags. The new baseline of the empath is characterized by an absolute, unyielding adherence to self-preservation. She learns to decouple her ability to feel someone else's pain from her obligation to fix it. She can observe a predator's manipulation, accurately profile their intent within seconds, and completely block their access to her emotional core without breaking a sweat. This transformation represents the ultimate shock to the social environment around her, because the people who once knew her as a soft, easily swayed pleaser suddenly find themselves standing before a deeply grounded, hyper-vigilant strategist who commands absolute respect. She speaks with a quiet, lethal clarity. Her boundaries are no longer open for discussion or compromise. They are enforced automatically by the sheer weight of her presence. She no longer seeks validation from the outside world because she has discovered a self-sustaining well of internal sovereignty. The apex shift is not born out of bitterness or malice, but out of a profound realization of her own worth and power. She remains an empath, capable of deep love, immense compassion, and profound human connection. But that empathy is now guarded by a razor-sharp operational perimeter that cannot be breached by any amount of psychological warfare. The predator who tried to break her mistakenly thought they were destroying an easy target, entirely unaware that their cruelty acted as the catalyst